The Odyssey by Homer. And whoever Homer was, the Odyssey was composed after the Iliad, likely in 725 BC. The Odyssey tells the adventures of Odysseus, as the title suggests. Of course, the title was given much later. Let's look at what we know from the Iliad to discover who is Odysseus as we start the Odyssey. In the Iliad, we are first introduced to Odysseus when Athena is encouraging him to rally the Greeks. If you remember, Agamemnon had said as a test of his men, let's just go home. And then everyone ran to the ships in order to go home, and Athena had to intervene. As we'll see as well in the Odyssey, Athena is a partner with Odysseus, and she is even in the Iliad. So she encourages Odysseus to use his power of speech to rally the men, to walk away from the ships and instead return to Agamemnon and be ready to fight. And so that's what we see at the beginning of the Iliad, is that Odysseus has the power of speech, that Athena is on his side, and that he is able to lead and rally his men. In the catalog of ships, if you remember, we see that Odysseus has quite a small fleet. Those who left Ithaca behind, Odysseus was their leader. He was Zeus's match in wisdom, and he has 12 scarlet-prowed ships. So only 12 ships, not 40, not 100. It's a small group, but it is a powerful group. And this is how we first get introduced to Odysseus. The next time we see him is in Iliad 3. Priam is looking over the edge of the Trojan wall, and he is asking Helen to come to him and to explain who it is that he sees on the battlefield. Now, many scholars have wondered why this scene didn't occur maybe 9 years before this moment, and why is this occurring in the 9th book or the 9th year of the war? But it does make sense in the order of the Iliad that we get to hear about each of these men. We get to hear a description of what they look like and Helen's memory of them from when she was in Sparta. So let's look at the description of Odysseus. Odysseus is described by Priam as lesser in height than Agamemnon, so he's a smaller man, he's shorter in stature. But he's broad in shoulders and chest. He looks like a ram. This description of Odysseus as a ram will come to play in book 9 of the Odyssey, when he actually hides himself as a ram from Polyphemus. I would liken him to a deep fleeced ram, Priam says, who moves among a great flock of gleaming white sheep. And if tradition is correct, this passage was written or composed 20 years before the Odyssey, and yet it comes to resonate in the Odyssey. Helen responds, this is the son of Laertes. Remember that we designate these warriors according to their fathers, right? This is in a sense a way of understanding their last names. The son of Laertes, resourceful Odysseus. There's one of his epithets that will come up again and again in the Odyssey. He was raised in the rugged country of Ithaca, knowing every kind of stratagem and shrewd plan. Again, an accurate description of who Odysseus comes to be in the Odyssey. Antenor describes Odysseus as surly when she first sees him, until he let go of the great voice from his chest and the words like snowflakes in winter. Then no other mortal man could rival Odysseus. So what we get to see from Odysseus is the man of many stratagems, he's the man of many plans, he's resourceful, and he's great in speech. This is the character that we will come to see in the Odyssey. The only other few times that we see him in the Iliad, and really he is a prime mover and agent in the Iliad, but Achilles, of course, has the primary stage, as does Agamemnon, as far as the Greeks are concerned. He speaks to Achilles. If you remember that scene from the Iliad, when he goes and speaks with Achilles, he's one of the 3 emissaries, and he is chosen because of his ability to speak, his ability with rhetoric. When he speaks to Achilles, he does not just list out the things that Agamemnon is offering Achilles as recompense for wanting Achilles to return to fighting. Instead, he changes things. He begins with this moving, stirring, rise up, Achilles, and come fight. Then he lists out all the gifts, and then he says, and if that is not enough, pity us. This is things he adds from Agamemnon's actual list of gifts. pity us Greeks who are having to fight and are losing without you. And then maybe you'll win glory by killing Hector, right? So he's trying to move his audience, really crafting his speech for who it is that's listening. And we'll see this again in the Odyssey, that Odysseus has the ability to craft his speech particularly for his audience, what are going to be the best possible means of persuasion, as Aristotle would say in his rhetoric. We won't spend long dwelling on the scene with Dolon when Diomedes and Odysseus actually spy on the Trojans, but the one last passage that I really want to showcase from the Iliad, that we can get a sense of Odysseus's character as we begin looking at the Odyssey, is this passage from 11. Agamemnon has been wounded, not fatally, but he is retreating. We know as an audience that Hector is going to be given this chance for an Aristeia. Of course, Odysseus and the rest of the Greeks do not know this, but they are fearful. And all of the Greeks leave, including Diomedes, who had been standing next to Odysseus. Everyone leaves except for Odysseus. He is standing there on the battlefield by his own, and it says, "And spear-famed Odysseus was left on his own, nor did any one of the Argives stay with him, since fear had seized them all." So what we see is a man who has courage, who stands alone, apart from the rest. Then trouble he spoke to his own great-spirited heart. "Ah me, what will become of me? Great is the evil if I should take flight in fear of this outnumbering, but more dreaded is this, if I should be caught on my own. The son of Cronus has put to flight the other Danaans, but why does my heart debate these things? For I know that cowards must shrink from war, and he who would be best in battle, he must strongly stand his ground, whether he is killed or kills another." A similar speech was given by Sarpedon in Book 12 to rally his friend Glaucus when the Trojans were going to fight, right? Glory is either to be killed or to kill, and we see Odysseus, at least on the battlefield, saying, "This is what I must do. I must be brave. This is what I am fighting for glory and for fame." And we will see a different kind of drive, a different kind of motivation in the Odyssey from this. At the same time, it's important to remember that we do have a very brave figure, but we also have a solitary figure. One who, even when the rest of the men are gone, stands apart and has no fear of being isolated or of being alone. We are reading the text in translation. This is a Greek text that was sung originally. It was meant to be sung, and yet we are looking at it through the lens of English, which means there's going to be some distance from us and from the text. What I would like to highlight is what we see in all of these texts. If we look at the 4 or 5 different translations that I've put up here from Fitzgerald and Lattimore and Fagles and now Emily Wilson, which will be the primary text that I will be using, "Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story of that man," which is actually the first word in the Greek, "skilled in all ways of contending, polytropos, the wanderer harried for years on end." And I've highlighted these words in all of the translations, aner, which means man, and polytropos, which means many twists and turns, right? So we have someone who Emily Wilson calls complicated, is how she refers to polytropos, but we have a man of many twists and turns. The phrase "sing me" or "tell me" really is where we get the word epic from. Epos in the Greek would just be the song or the tale, right, the story. So we are having a story about a man of many twists and turns, and this will take on lots of different meanings throughout the narrative. What does it mean to be a man of many twists and turns? So we'll look at that more closely. What it does mean for Odysseus is not just his character, that he's a man of many twists and turns. He will actually have many different faces that Athena will give him, many different disguises that he will take on, many different stories about who he is, many different identities that he will take on. He also goes on many twists and turns on his actual journey. He will travel back and forth many different times to many different places. And so the many twists and turns becomes both an inner and an outer explanation of Odysseus's character, and we get that sense even from the beginning of the poem. When we look at the opening lines of the poem about Odysseus, what you should notice is that we don't actually see Odysseus. "Tell me about the complicated man, muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he wrecked the holy town of Troy." So anyone who's familiar with Greek epic. Anyone who's familiar with Greek epic knows that the sacker of Troy, or the man who wrecked holy Troy, was Odysseus. It's one of his other epithets, as we will see, is the city sacker. And so we get a sense that this would be about Odysseus from the third line, and yet he's not named, which is very important for our narrative. When Odysseus is named, when he is not named, becomes significant. This is a man who is losing identity, gaining identity, and trying really to discover true identity throughout the course of the narrative. So the fact that the poet leaves out his specific name, as opposed to the start of the Iliad, right, which begins with, "Sing to me, muse, of the wrath of the son of Peleus, Achilles." You get his full identity from the beginning. Here you don't have the full identity of Odysseus. He's not even named until we get to line 21. In these opening lines, we get a sense of someone who suffered. We know we're going to hear about when and where he went, whom he met, how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. We also have the whole storyline wrapped up here. Odysseus failed. We have the story of a man's failure. And for the mistakes of his men, they died. Now, let's find the beginning of the narrative. So from the opening of the poem, we know that this is going to be a story of adventure. This is going to be a story of the travails of someone who suffered and who also sacked Troy, and also who is a failure. And this is where we get the idea of the Greek hero. The word hero, of course, is only used once in the narrative, but we have a sense that Odysseus is the hero of our story, and yet we have to remember that it's not a hero in the same way that we would think of superheroes or that we would think of comic book heroes. Instead, what we have here is a hero who is a failure to bring his men back home, a failure to get home quickly, to get home and take care of his country quickly. Instead, he is the cause of a lot of loss of life. And we saw something very similar in the opening of Iliad, right? Remember, sing to me the wrath of Achilles, for whose sake many men died. And not just Trojan men, many of the Danaans, many of their souls went to Hades. So these are men whose tragic mistakes actually cost the lives of their own men. If we compare with the Iliad, we have two different kinds of stories, though there is a lot of overlap. I don't want to dichotomize the two stories too much. But the one begins with wrath, the other begins with man, and man in a sense of the human being, right? Sing to me of what it means to be a human being on a life of journeying, of failure, of suffering, and ultimately of homecoming. So one is a story of wrath and anger and fighting that ends with, as we remember, reconciliation and mourning. The other one is a story of peace in some sense. That would be the goal of the story, to come home and to be at peace. And as we'll see, those will be the last words of the narrative, to end in oaths of peace. The word polytropos, which begins the journey, this is the twists and turns, and also homecoming, nostos. These are words that we didn't see in the Iliad. These are new ideas that we'll have to dwell on more fully as we get into the Odyssey. The story really is about hospitality, ultimately. In the Iliad, if you remember, Rachel Baspeloff said that we really cannot have good guys and bad guys in the Iliad. The Trojans seem just as good as the Greeks do, or maybe even better. Whereas in this story, there's more of a clear delineation between good and bad guys. The question is whether or not they are hospitable, right? As we enter each realm, every time that Odysseus makes it to a new island, you'll see him repeat the question, what kind of country is this? Are the people here hospitable and they revere the gods? Or do they not welcome strangers and are irreverent? These are the questions. And every time he knows whether people are good or bad, and the listeners would know whether someone was a moral person or not, dependent on how they welcomed the strangers, how they took care of the needy and the poor and the abject. And that's an interesting differentiation from the Iliad. In the Iliad, we saw a lot of heroes. We saw people winning their glory in battle. We saw people of the leadership, the kingly class. In this story, we will see a lot more about beggars, slaves. We don't really get to have full complex characters when it comes to these, the slaves and the herdsmen and so forth. But we do have whether they are moral or whether they are not, whether they are loyal to their masters or disloyal. We also have a lot more women included. When you talk about the Iliad, you're pretty much talking about men. But when you're talking about the Odyssey, you see a lot of women. We have Calypso, Circe, Penelope. Helen has a much fuller figure than she did in the Iliad. We really get a sense of what it means to be a good wife or to be a seductress, to be someone who reveres the gods or does not. And we have these characteristics not only in the kingly man Odysseus, and we have to register whether or not he is kingly and what kind of ruler he is, what kind of leader of his men he is. But we also get to see the kingly wife, Penelope, as she's called, and how does she lead? How does she run her household? Whether she is welcoming to the stranger or not. So we get to see quite a few characters and how they express xenia, how they express hospitality. So we'll be looking at xenia throughout the narrative, really to get a sense of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys.